Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So today is Churchill Day, 10th of May. I don't think anyone else calls it Churchill Day, but I always remember this is the day that he became the Prime Minister. So it's worrying that a lot of children in the United Kingdom don't know who he was. Well, Winston Leonard Spencer-Churchill was Prime Minister from 1940 to 45, and again 1951 to 55. People just think he's that dog on the insurance advertisement. Some teenagers knew he's something to do with the Second World War, but think he might have been a general or something. I can understand why they're a tad confused, as he sometimes appeared in military uniform during the war. So Churchill, he was born in 1874, and he died in 1965, and he was one of only, I think, 3 commoners ever to have a state funeral, the others being the Duke of Wellington and Lord Nelson. So I'll talk about the significance of Churchill probably towards the end, and maybe the circumstances in which he became First Lord of the Treasury. His ancestors had been fairly prominent landowners in southwest England for centuries, particularly in Wiltshire, and one of his ancestors had fought on the Royalist side in the English Civil War. That's in the 1640s. And by the 1680s, his ancestor, John Churchill, was quite a high-ranking army officer. So Charles II was king. There had been an Anglo-Dutch war. And Charles II's younger brother was James II. John Churchill's sister became the mistress of James II and had children with him. Now, in those days, for a woman to give birth outside of marriage was considered shameful. However, if the father of this baby was someone highborn, a prince no less, well, that would really discount the shame completely. Whereas if the father of her baby was an ordinary man, then she was disgraced and insulted. Oh, I know it was a grossly hypocritical time, but there we are. So in 1685, James II succeeded to the throne. He was a Roman Catholic. Almost nobody was Catholic in England at the time. So James II's nephew, the Duke of Monmouth, tried to overthrow him. The Duke of Monmouth was born outside of marriage. He was the son of Charles II's mistress. But anyway, the Duke of Monmouth, who was defeated, partly through the efforts of John Churchill. So that was that Duke of Monmouth executed. So John Churchill stayed loyal to King James II, even though John Churchill was an Anglican, as in a member of the Church of England, like most people in England at the time. About 1688, I won't go into this too much, is a revolution, often known as the Glorious Revolution, and John Churchill, like most of the army, deserted James II. You might say that's outrageous, that's treason. You gave your oath of allegiance to this king, and now you're turning your hand against him. So John Churchill and most of the others went over to William of Orange's side, William of Orange being the nephew of James II, and indeed the son-in-law of James II, married to James II's daughter Mary. So James II fled. So John Churchill, he gained more preferment for having turned his coat. England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales were ruled by William III, that's formerly William of Orange, and his wife Mary. William and Mary, like the college in America, William and Mary. And John Churchill, there was even more reason for him to rise up the ranks, because his wife was a dear friend of Queen Anne when she came in. Well, Queen Anne only took over in 1701 when William III died. So there's a lot of fighting this time, the Williamite wars against the Jacobites being adherents of James II. What else? So the wars of the League of Augsburg were going on back then. Then in the very early 18th century, there was a war of Spanish succession when Ferdinand, the Electoral Prince of Bavaria, died. And it was not sure who was going to be the next king of Spain. So the person in line to be king of Spain was the grandson of the King of France, Louis XIV's grandson. So the British were aghast at the idea that the crowns of France and Spain might be united. One person would rule both. France was then La Grande Nation. It was the mightiest country in Europe, and Spain had huge possessions in Latin America. So the United Kingdom, well, it was only the United Kingdom from 1707. Anyway, the United Kingdom and several other European countries were leagued against Spain and France to prevent them uniting, and eventually succeeded. There was a lot of fighting in what is now Belgium, the Battle of Oudenaarde, for example. So John Churchill was over there fighting there, the Battle of Malplaquet, and later in what's now Germany, the Battle of Blenheim in Bavaria. But Blenheim then became bastardized into Blenheim in English. So when the British and their allies were victorious over the French and the Bavarians, John Churchill was granted this new house. Well, Parliament paid for it, Blenheim Palace, which is about 8 miles north of Oxford. It's enormous. You should see it was the largest non-royal palace in the country, and indeed it does have the name Palace. It's not Blenheim House. And even the trees are planted to represent the positions of troop formations during the battle. It's got many enormous tapestries there. One of its rooms is the longest room in England, as in, if you look at length in relation to breadth. So that was that. So that he was then ennobled. He got the title Duke of Marlborough because they had extensive estates near the town of Marlborough. So the Churchill family was prominent for several centuries, but they never quite rose to the top of the greasy pole, being prime minister, something like that. They intermarried with a well-known family from the Norfolk area, the Spencer family, and the surname became Spencer-Churchill. So Winston Churchill, as we know him, was born in November 1874, and he was born only about 7 months after his parents' marriage. So his father was Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough, as in Lord Randolph Churchill was not going to inherit the title Duke, his elder brother was. And Randolph Churchill was a man about town. He was a Tory MP, and he had met an American young lady called Jenny Jerome the summer before at Cowes Week off the Isle of Wight. Back then, a lot of people used to go yachting there. Now, hardly anybody does that these days because people go on holiday abroad. But remember, this is the 1870s. There were no planes. Even train travel was a lot slower back then. So she was one of these buccaneers, these very affluent young women from the United States who came to find husbands. So these British aristocrats, they lacked money, and some of these wealthy American women felt that they lacked breeding or social graces or something like that, because obviously just a couple of generations before, their family had often been working class and they'd made money very quickly. So the United States is meant to be egalitarian. It's obviously not financially egalitarian, but like everywhere, snobbery pretty soon builds itself up, okay? And the United Kingdom was a very snobbish society. So some British people felt they were inherently superior, especially the nobility. But anyway, there might have been something a bit more laudable to it, some genuine affection. So they married. So did Lord Randolph Churchill press his suit before they married? The baby was born only 7 months later, or perhaps the baby was immature. Not immature, sorry, premature. They were at a ball in Blenheim Palace, and she suddenly felt her waters breaking, contractions, rushed into a side room where she parturited, and that was Winston Leonard Spencer-Churchill. Remember, he had a double-barreled name, Spencer-Churchill. So that was that. He was a bit below average height, and he had a shoulder which often became dislocated. I wonder if that might be to do with him being premature. So that was that, and they were blessed with a boy whom they named Jack about 6 years later. So what else about them? The marriage broke down pretty soon, and they were largely leading separate lives after the birth of Jack. So Lord Randolph Churchill was a man of vaulting ambition, became Chancellor of the Exchequer, and famously of the Home Rule issue in Ireland, he said, he toyed with the idea, should we actually embrace Home Rule? And the Conservative Party formed an alliance with the Irish nationalists. But no, for completely cynical reasons, he went right the other way and said, okay, we'll be dead against Home Rule for Ireland. The orange card will be the one to play, and I hope it'll be the ace and not the two, using a gambling metaphor, and he was a great man for playing the tables. A bit like when he started using this phrase, Tory democracy. For the Conservative Party, the very word democracy had been anathema only a few years earlier. When asked to define Tory democracy, he said opportunism, mostly. So occasionally he was just disarmingly candid. Anyway, so Winston Churchill, though he was immensely privileged in some respects, his family were wealthy, he was neglected, he was emotionally stunted, I suppose. He went to St. George's School, Ascot, which still exists. It was then a boys' prep school. It's now a girls' secondary school. And there's a house named Churchill in his honour. The headmaster there was a flagellomaniac. This was the time when physical correction was absolutely standard in schools throughout the British Empire. Latin and ancient Greek were core subjects, and he was dreadful at those. Later he went on to Harrow School. So Lord Randolph Churchill had been to Eton, and those were considered the duopoly of British schools, Eton and Harrow. Lord Randolph had loathed Eton, and so had his boy go to Harrow School, which is in North London. So Churchill, again, he struggled academically because he was no great shakes at classics, but he found history absolutely fascinating, and he was clearly academically gifted. He memorised the whole of the Lays of Ancient Rome by Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay. The Lays of Ancient Rome, they're not very well known these days, but in the 19th century, they were very fashionable, and they'd been published not long before. Macaulay died in only 1850, if memory serves. So how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods, and things like that? I remember reading, I think it's On Another Man's Flame by Ernie O'Malley, recording the Irish Civil War, and somebody's quoting that one as well. So, and he was pretty dreadful at mathematics, but he was known to be valiant and willing to fight boys twice his size. He didn't quite overlap with Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister, who was there. What a thing if they'd met, they were at the same school. So it was coming up time to leave Harrow, and these days virtually everybody goes to a top public school, goes on to university. Not so back then. Only a tiny minority of people went to university, not even 2%. So people from that sort of background, they might go and run their family estate, join the family firm or something. But in his case, he decided to join the army. So people joining the army, the clever ones might join the artillery or the engineers because they had to calculate the trajectory of shells or something, or how to build a bridge. And the reasonably academic ones would be infantry officers. The dimmest of the dim became cavalry officers. So he joined the cavalry. But as I say, when it came to his own language, he was obviously someone with an exceptional verbal fluency. So he went to Sandhurst, that's the Royal Military Academy, which had been founded not long before, because prior to that, people had bought their commissions. And he duly passed out as a cavalry officer. So relative to an army officer, especially a cavalry officer, he was not that well off because, his family had some money, but his father had squandered it, particularly on wages. So his allowance was not that big because a lot of these cavalry officers expected to have a private income to live off. There was a certain social life they were required to live, and that was difficult to pay for. So Churchill began his drinking habit. The thing about Churchill is he never got drunk. He just never got sober either. Yeah? So that's why he was obviously spending a lot of money on that. Anyway, so he went out to India and he served there. He spent a lot of his time reading Gibbon, Decline and Fall, and so on, and Curtin. And he decided that he was a liberal in politics because his family were conservative. So as we'll see, despite his convictions actually being liberals, he decided to make his name as a conservative because it was going to be a lot easier for him. He had all the contacts. And he had an Indian Batman there who was very fond of, and he set him up with a pension for the rest of his life. But when I say Batman, I don't mean like Batman and Robin. It means a personal servant. And he fought with the Malakand field force in what is now Pakistan, and he wrote an account of that, which is very worth reading and quite moving. So he often put himself in harm's way, deliberately seeking out dangerous situations, even though there's no rationale for doing so, beyond proving his valour. Anyway, he did not care about Indian history or civilization, thought that really it was tedious, it had nothing to teach him. So he was closed-minded in that regard. So then returned to the United Kingdom. Cuba was still a Spanish colony at this time. In the late 1890s, there was a separatist rebellion in Cuba, so he went out there as a journalist to cover it. Had a very romantic and adventurous spirit, and was very pugnacious. And he could see both sides of an argument, and partly he sympathised with these gallant rebels, and partly he sympathised with the forces of law and order who are trying to stifle the rebellion and saying that their cause is legitimate, because he was a sentimental imperialist. Anyway, that was that. He'd left by the time the United States intervened and Cuba became independent. So in 1898, he went to Sudan. He'd managed to get himself attached to the army there. Remember, the British army and the Egyptian army were going in to defeat the Mahdeists. The Mahdi was this guy who came along and said he was a reincarnation of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. The Mahdi was dead by this time, but he had his Khalifa ruling, as in his successor. So this is one of the last successful cavalry charges in British history, the Battle of Omdurman, in which he took part, and his shoulder became dislocated during that. Couldn't use his sabre, so had to use his revolver. So, but you think, wouldn't that be the same hand? Anyway, somehow he managed it. Lord Kitchener was in charge there, whom we found absolutely terrifying. Lord Kitchener, by this stage, was thought to be a legend in his own lifetime. And he recounts fighting there with considerable sang-froid, and recalled how easy it is to kill a man. So he doesn't seem to have any compunction about doing that. I mean, I know it was his life or somebody else's, but still. And he later wrote a book about this conflict entitled The River War, because the Anglo-Egyptian army was advancing down the River Nile and obviously using it for transport as well as water. Big steamships had to build a special railway. And he was not a closed-minded nationalist. He was willing to castigate his own side, recalling how some British troops deliberately killed wounded enemy soldiers. Now, if these men were mortally wounded, then I suppose it might have been the coup de grâce. So later he went to South Africa. Remember, 1899 to 1902 was the South African War, the Boer War, as we often call it, the second one. And he was a journalist. And there is this incident over which much ink has been spilt about an ambush on a train where he actually started fighting, and then he was captured by the Boers. Now, you can't have it both ways. You're either a journalist or you're a soldier, and don't try to exploit the difference. So should he be executed for fighting whilst out of uniform and pretending to be a non-combatant when actually being a combatant and things like that? But he managed to escape. Now, Churchill was perhaps not always as honourable as some would wish to believe, and someone else was part of his escape plot, and allegedly he left his mate in the lurch and did the 60 agreement and just left. On the other hand, if you realise that his escape plot was jeopardised, one person getting away is better than nobody getting away. Anyway, he managed to escape and was hidden down a mine for a while, made it all the way to Lourenço Marques, as in that's now Maputo in Mozambique, a neutral country. It was a Portuguese colony, and got back. So he was soon elected MP for Oldham. This is shortly after Black Week. So-called Black Week was a week in 1899 where the British Army suffered 3 defeats in 1 week. So the British Empire was the mightiest force in the world at the time, and yet was being humiliated by the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State. So this really was ignominious. So finally there was a little bit of good news for the British public that Churchill had escaped. By the way, his father had died by this time. He was 20 when his father died, and Mrs. Everest, his nanny, died. Womany, as he used to call her, because he had a much more of an emotional bond with her than he did with either of his parents. So his parents didn't care for him, wouldn't write to his letters. He'd write to them, imploring them to visit him at school, and despite him beseeching them to show him some sort of affection, they didn't, and he felt he didn't live up to their standards. Also, his father was dying of syphilis in the 1890s. It was completely obvious with his slurred speech, with his lack of cognitive function or executive function, things like that. Obviously, syphilis is heritable, and the physicians were worried that Churchill or his brother might have been born with it, his mother might have contracted it, in fact that they hadn't. So this was considered so embarrassing that the Churchill family tried to keep it secret. But one time when Churchill was making an ass of himself at a dinner party, years later, someone said to him, "Winston, what did your father die of?" Because they knew there was something the way they could get back at him. I'm not sure what the official cause of death, what they announced was, but he's Lord Randolph Churchill, like so many of the others, is buried just outside Blenheim Palace at Byland. Or is it Byland? I can't remember. I should remember. Is within sight of the room where Churchill was born. So Churchill was elected Member of Parliament for Oldham, a Conservative, and there'd been a khaki election in 1900 where they'd done well. But by 1904, it was clear that the Conservatives were rather less popular, or Unionists, as you might call them, because the Conservatives obviously had Liberal Unionists as allies, and their main opponents was the Liberal Party, led by Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman. So in 1904, he crossed the floor, as in he became a Liberal, and so people were aghast and felt he was doing it simply for self-advancement, not out of any principled reason. On the other hand, the Liberals took it as quite a fillip to their morale, because Churchill was a bit of a political weather vane. If he was joining on their side, it's because he believed that they would win, and indeed he was perspicacious in making that prediction. So in 1905, the Liberals became the government. In 1906, they called an election, and they won by a landslide. Well, actually, they won loads of seats, but actually their share of the vote was not that much higher than the Conservatives, only about 6% higher. So Churchill made a speech for the Liberals saying, "We know what another Tory government will mean. Dear food for the millions, cheap labour for the millionaire." Dear, using the old-fashioned sense, as in expensive, because the Conservatives were thinking about bringing in tariff reform, an import tax on things from outside the empire to encourage people within the British Empire to buy imperial products. And the idea is that would drive up food prices. And that the Conservatives would make sure that people were paid starvation wages. So he held various of the great offices of state, Home Secretary this time. I'm not sure he was ever Foreign Secretary, actually. So Home Secretary is in charge of prisons and the police, and he was, I suppose, quite humane, bringing in fines and probation and things like that. Well, previously, people were sent to prison for actually trifling offences, like urinating in the street, using vulgar language, playing ball games in the street, things like that. So, and later he was First Lord of the Admiralty. He got on very well with David Lloyd George, who was a liberal luminary, seen as a radical, absolutely abominated by the Conservative Party around about 1900, because David Lloyd George had suggested that the United Kingdom was on the wrong side of the South African conflict, ought to make peace. So Churchill really believed in building up the armed forces. He wasn't anti-German per se, but he wanted the Royal Navy to be enormous. And this is the difficult thing. So you want to have the beginnings of a welfare state, like old age pensions and things like that, and free medical inspections for children and free milk for skilled children in school. But you also want to build more warships. Dreadnoughts had come in. That's going to lead to a large rise in taxation. This sharp increase in taxation might damage the economy. So he was invited to Germany to attend German military manoeuvres, and British and German people got on just fine in the years before the First World War. So it became very embarrassing to people like Churchill when the war broke out that they'd been so pally with the Germans, as though people should have always thought that the Germans were barbarians, which of course is a vile and bigoted thing to say. Anyway, 1914, assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So the Liberal cabinet reflected in July 1914, if there is to be a European conflict, happily we'll be no more than spectators. But what should be done? Well, there's a cabinet meeting. At the beginning of the cabinet meeting, it looked like the United Kingdom, and therefore the whole of the empire, would remain at peace. But Churchill said, no, this invasion of Belgium is completely unacceptable. And Churchill and a couple of other hotheads managed to talk the cabinet into a declaration of war by the end. So that was it. Famously, their ultimatum to Germany: you must withdraw from Belgium immediately. Remember that 1939 Treaty of London, in which Prussia, a predecessor state of the German Empire, promised to respect Belgium's neutrality and independence. You're in breach of that. You must pull out immediately, or we shall declare war on you. And of course, the Kaiser did not do so. So Belgium put the kibosh on the Kaiser. So I won't go through the First World War, giving a blow-by-blow account. But one of Churchill's bright ideas was the Gallipoli campaign, because Russia was having awful difficulty, and the Western Allies thought we need to supply them with weapons, we need to maybe send troops to them. And also it would mean that grain could come out through that way, and there were food shortages in Western Europe, grain from Ukraine. So could we force the Straits of the Dardanelles? That's where Istanbul is. And the Royal Navy had looked into this thrice before, and their feasibility studies, they twice concluded it was impossible, once it was possible. So initially, Churchill thought about simply a naval campaign, no landing, because the Royal Navy was much mightier than the Ottoman Navy. But, in March 1915, the Royal Navy bombarded the forts around Çanakkale, but unsuccessfully. They weren't able to get through. They built up a lot of troops, and then they landed in April 1915. It was also trying to surround the Central Powers on a Europe-wide scale to defeat them that way. No rapid progress could be made on the Western Front because the trenches were so good, so many advantages on the side of the defender, as in barbed wire, these machine gun nests, landmines, and so on. They thought the Ottoman Empire might be relatively easy to knock out. If the Royal Navy could sail through the Sea of Marmara, get to Istanbul, we then call it Constantinople, and could say to the Ottomans, you either surrender or we're just going to flatten your capital city with a bombardment. Well, even if the Royal Navy had flattened Istanbul, the Ottomans could still have fought on in the rest of the country. Turkey is a very mountainous country. The Ottoman Empire extended well beyond Turkey. It was far too optimistic. Anyway, I shan't go into Gallipoli, but it was a defeat for the Allies. Having said that, it actually caused the Ottomans more casualties than it caused the Allies. So it's not the catastrophe it's sometimes portrayed at, that yes, the objectives were not attained, but it caused the Ottomans such heavy casualties, it really helped lead to their defeat. And it took the pressure off other fronts. So that was that. But anyway, he had to carry the can for this. This was his baby to some extent. And Ian Hamilton was the general in charge of that campaign. He was a close friend of Churchill's, and indeed he was killed in the campaign. So Churchill said, okay, I'll resign from the cabinet, I'll join the Royal Scots. He went off with that regiment and served some time in the Western Front, giving out his cigars to so many of his soldiers, because he smoked tens of thousands of these Cuban cigars in his life. He certainly was a man who indulged himself, could always afford a bottle of champagne for himself and a friend. He's made a lot of his money through journalism. Anyway, so the war was finally over. And he'd been one of those who said, let's fight to the finish. His attitude was always to absolutely beat the enemy and then offer fairly lenient peace terms. Wouldn't it be better to negotiate some sort of compromise, a draw, or even conditional surrender, and that would save lives? But there we are. So then he was back in the cabinet, and soon as there was the conflict in Ireland, where the separatists, that's the Sinn Féin party, they wanted the whole of Ireland to leave the United Kingdom and become a republic, and there was an insurrection. So Churchill said they must be defeated. This is unacceptable. So members of the Irish police, it's the Royal Irish Constabulary, so many of them were killed, were wounded. Some of them retired. They weren't being replaced. Very few recruits were coming through for the police because it was so dangerous. So he suggested recruiting some ex-soldiers and sailors to go over and be and help the police in Ireland, specifically the counterinsurgent role. So they did, but sometimes discipline broke down and they committed crimes. So they're the Royal Irish Constabulary Special Reserve, pejoratively known as the Black and Tans, and people try and lay this at Churchill's door as well. So anyway, finally in July 1921, a truce was agreed between the IRA, Irish Republican Army, and the Crown Forces. And Michael Collins came to London. He was a head honcho of the IRA. So our Churchill changed completely, saying that obviously that Michael Collins had been an absolute blackguard and ought to be hanged, to being very pally with him. And when Collins was killed by the IRA in August 1922, he said he was the gallant leader of a valiant race. So Churchill really could see both sides of the argument. So Churchill was colonial secretary for a while. He was a man who had the racial prejudices of the time. I'm talking about Indians in Kenya saying they're drawn from the very lowest class of coolie and shouldn't have the right to vote. It's very abrasive language by our standards. Remember, he changed again. He changed from conservative to liberal, back to conservative. He briefly stood as a constitutionalist, said he was an anti-socialist. And he was out of Parliament briefly. He'd represented Dundee, and his opponent, the Scottish National Party opponent, had been a sergeant in the Royal Scots. He'd served with them at the Western Front. So he was also in favour of intervening in the Russian Civil War on the white side against the Reds, against the communists, saying that communism ought to be strangled at birth. But that didn't happen. So perhaps I shouldn't go through his career, but he had years in the wilderness. So he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the late 1920s. He helped bring Britain back onto the gold standard. So if you could go into a bank with your money and get gold, or go into a bank with gold and get money, gives people confidence in the currency. And the suits in the city were in favour of it. Despite Churchill's misgivings, he went ahead with that, but people said that kept unemployment stubbornly high in the late 20s. So by the 1930s, he seemed to be cantankerous and just enjoying being a grumpy old man, and he was out of office, and he was very immoderate on the Indian question. Should India take steps towards independence? And Churchill had set his face against that. So the Tory reactionaries, well, he was their poster boy. And then he became a Jeremiah, thundering against appeasement. And well, 1939, when the war broke out, he was brought back as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he'd held in 1914. And a message went out to all Royal Naval ships, Winston is back. So he made some radio broadcasts early in the war. Remember, Neville Chamberlain was Prime Minister until May 1940. And Churchill said this war was going to take at least 3 years. So he was facing up to the fact that this was not going to be an easy win. and being frank with the public. They needed to, because people had been far too gung-ho and optimistic in 1914, saying all over by Christmas. So people have got to know just how difficult this struggle is going to be. And it was increasingly prominent, helping, and the Graf Spee was sunk, that German surface raider, destroying a lot of merchant ships. So some successes for the Royal Navy. Remember, like, he is the civilian, he's the politician in charge of the Royal Navy. These are the first Sea Lords, are the role. The naval officers, the very senior naval officers. So fast forward, well, the Norway campaign. Germany gets her iron ore from Sweden, and the Gulf of Bothnia freezes in winter, so it's shipped out. So it's taken out by rail to Norway and then shipped. So the Allies thought they could cut off Germany from Norway. Germany wouldn't have enough iron ore to prosecute the war. Nonsense, really, because they're still trading with the Soviets. But the French and British were considering invading Norway anyway, then, which was obviously be completely in breach of the principle for which they fought, which is protecting other countries like Poland. Anyway, Germany saved them the bother, and the Germans invaded the Norwegians, so the Norwegians appealed to the French and British for help, who then rushed troops to Norway. But anyway, it was a defeat for the French and the British. So there were the Norway debates in Parliament, and people were booing Neville Chamberlain, who's a very uninspiring, gangly, toothsome figure, who didn't come across as manly, who was just so morose and grandfatherly, effete and feeble. And so someone, I can't remember which Tory MP quoted Cromwell saying, "For God's sake, go." So Neville Chamberlain realised he'd lost the confidence of the House and resigned. And they say that actually quite a few of the Conservatives wanted to keep him on. It was a minority of Conservatives joined together with Labour MPs, made Chamberlain go. So then who was to be appointed? Well, King George VI, should he appoint the Earl of Halifax, who was in the House of Lords, of course, or should he appoint Winston Churchill? He chose to appoint Churchill. But was this on the advice of the previous Prime Minister? I don't know. And of course, Churchill wasn't actually leader of the Conservative Party at the time. So Churchill then became the King's first minister, as he said. Well, I won't go into his whole career. What goes on in the Second World War is too well known. So he was a real Renaissance man, and he was a gifted writer. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. In his youth, he'd been an outstanding athlete. He'd been the public schools fencing champion. He was a pilot as well, and this is the time of the First World War, when flying was incredibly dangerous. It was almost as though he had a death wish. Well, he said he was plagued by the black dog. He appeared to have bipolar disorder, because sometimes could be incredibly energetic and buoyant, and inspiring all those around him, putting fresh heart into people, even when the news from the battlefront was dismal. And he would stun people with his physical energy, jumping over walls and things like that, even in his 60s. But other times he would be really melancholic, down in the dumps, and not going out of bed to the afternoon, and drinking whiskey from the morning. So the black dog, he said sometimes he decided he better not stand near the edge of a railway platform, lest he suddenly be taken by the urge to throw himself in front of an oncoming train, things like that. So he got married to Clementine Hosier before the First World War. They had 4 daughters and 1 son. One of their daughters died in infancy. So one of his daughters married a prominent politician, Soames. His daughter Sarah was a Hollywood actress in the late 40s, though she wasn't really a household name. And his son, Randolph Churchill, well, he went to Eton, he went to Christ Church, Oxford, which is the most celebrated college in Oxford University, and he left early without a degree, which wasn't that uncommon in those days. And famously, there was the King and Country debate in 1933, just after Hitler became Chancellor. This house would under no circumstances fight for King and Country. Randolph came back to Oxford a week later to try and for a debate to try and get the secretary to expunge that from the record, saying it was such a shameful avowal, this pacifism, and failed. So he was a hothead and a loudmouth, Randolph Churchill, and Randolph realised he was a bit of a disgrace to his father, became quite a distinguished journalist and army officer in the Second World War, in the parachute regiment and so on, going to Yugoslavia, being Britain's contact with Tito's communist partisans. Such was the importance that the UK attached to that relationship. They sent the Prime Minister's son and had some narrow escapes from the Germans in Yugoslavia. It doesn't exist anymore, Yugoslavia. So he only survived his father by two years. But Randolph Churchill, he was famously married to Pamela Harriman, who was a notorious man-eater, were having affairs with just about everybody ended up as an American citizen, as a Clinton fundraiser, as American ambassador to Paris, who indeed died en poste and got the Legion d'honneur posthumously. So, Churchill, amazing, he came back as Prime Minister in the 50s, even though he was increasingly out of it. He had strokes, but there was no 24-hour media news cycle, and that was kept secret from the public. So when the war, we're always hearing how well he got on with Roosevelt, who supposedly said, "It's wonderful to share a decade with you." In fact, behind the scenes, the chemistry was not as good as the public were led to believe, because if the public heard that actually these two men disagreed and sometimes clashed, that would do nothing to advance the Allied war effort. It would only undermine it. So we mustn't be publicly rowing. Well, I could go on and on about Churchill. You should read his multi-volume history of the Second World War. So he was an exceptionally prolific author. He used to paint so many watercolors and things like that. The Second World War, the only one he ever painted was in Marrakesh, Morocco. And once he retired, he used to go to... he went to Tangier a little bit in Morocco. He'd been on holiday to Cuba as well, absolutely years ago. I'm not sure if it was as late as the 50s. So that was Churchill, the Lion, as he wished to be known, but really said, no, it's my father was a lion, not me. But he didn't agree with his father on everything. Remember, his father had been dead against Home Rule for Ireland, whereas Churchill famously had gone to Belfast in 1912 to address a Home Rule rally at a stadium which I think is now Casement Park, a GAA stadium. There's a rich irony. And so some loyalist protesters were irate that Churchill should do this and were tempted to tip his car into the River Lagan. And had Churchill's wife not been present, they might have done so. So there we are, a man of myriad contradictions, an absolutely intriguing character, very inspiring, but I'm certainly not blind to his multiple faults. So this is Churchill Day, 10th of May, when he took over under very impropitious circumstances, just after Britain and France's defeat in Norway, when the Second World War was going on. And people mustn't say, oh, Britain fought alone. The British had the whole empire on their side, the Canadians, the Australians, the Nigerians, the Ugandans, the Indians, and so on. So we often overlook many of these African colonies, or overlook many of the Caribbean countries like Jamaica or Trinidad, who all contributed as well. So it's really delusion to say that Britain fought alone. I did not become the King's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, he said. But the thing was, the United Kingdom was hugely enfeebled by the Second World War, despite winning it, and hugely impoverished, and that made the dissolution of the British Empire almost inevitable. So there we are, someone who's gone down in history as embodying bulldog spirit, a very inspiring and fascinating leader. They don't make them like that anymore.